All right, now we're going to talk about feedback loops. So there's two different types, positive and negative, right? And so these feedback loops play a very important role in the endocrine system, right? And so the way they usually work is via twofold. It's a stimulus and a response. So these two phenomena makes it actually very probable for a feedback loop to be taking place, right? So when we look at a positive feedback loop, so when we talk about stimulus, we're talking about the presence of some kind of chemical messenger. We can talk about quote unquote hormones, some kind of receptor, right? That's stimulated. So something is there when we talk about the stimulus. And so when we look at a positive feedback loop, when the stimulus is there, this causes an activation of the response. Vice versa, when we look at the negative feedback loops here, this leads to an inhibition of the actual response, right? And so when we look at a positive response, so we'll put that in red here. A perfect example of a positive feedback loop is oxytocin, right? So oxytocin is a hormone that was responsible for milk ejection, uterine contractions, and the love hormone, quote unquote, right? And so when is it stimulated? For example, we can take example labor, right? So when the baby wants to come out of the mom, right? And the mom's been in labor for 48 hours and it's going crazy. She's going crazy. She thinks, okay, what's going on? What's wrong? Okay, so the whole mechanism of how this actual birth takes place is a positive feedback loop involving oxytocin. So what happens first is that you have these mechanoreceptors. So you have these mechanoreceptors present in the cervix and regions of the uterus, right? So you have these mechanoreceptors that are present. And these mechanoreceptors transmit signal from the sensory nervous system all the way up to the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary for the release of oxytocin. Right, so now oxytocin is released into the bloodstream, right? So now oxytocin is one of the functions here is to stimulate uterine contraction. So when the oxytocin comes in, binds to the uterus, you have these uterine contractions that are taking place, right? So uterus contracts, right? And so what do you think happens to these mechanoreceptors again? Are they stimulated or inhibited? Well, because the uterus contracts, and again, you have more push on the cervix, right? Again, these mechanoreceptors are stimulated, again, leading to more oxytocin release, and then you have more uterine contractions, right? So this is an example of a presence of a stimulus which causes an activation or the release of the response. The stimulus is the mechanoreceptors, the actual response is the secretion of oxytocin, right? And this continues in this circle here, right? Until when? When does this, do you think, stops? When do you think there's an inhibition of a positive feedback loop? Birth, right? So whenever the baby is born, now, there is no more stimulation on these mechanoreceptors, right? So lack of this stimulation leads to the inhibition of oxytocin release. So this is positive feedback loop that we're looking at here. Negative feedback loop is a little bit more different, right? So let's look at testosterone, for example. So if you remember how the mechanism for testosterone is present. So we have GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, that's released from the hypothalamus, binds to the anterior pituitary, all the gonadotropes, and they secrete out FSH and LH, so follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And then eventually here, you have the release of testosterone when it binds to the gonad. So in the males, we're looking at the testosterone. So testosterone gets released, right? And so the way this is regulated is whenever these hormones are being secreted, testosterone becomes the actual stimulus here, right? And so how so? So this becomes the stimulus. Well, when testosterone has a very low concentration, it does not have any role in actually causing any inhibition of these other hormones released from the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. However, whenever testosterone passes a certain threshold, right, and the concentration of testosterone is very high, this causes an inhibition to the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, right? So if you remember, so gonadotropin releasing hormone gets stopped, follicular stimulating hormone gets stopped. And so what happens after this inhibition, right? What happens to this testosterone levels? Eventually it goes down, right? So if you remember, when we look at a negative feedback loop, when the stimulus is present, so when you have high concentration of testosterone, this leads to an inhibition. So an inhibition of the anterior pituitary from releasing these respective hormones and also the hypothalamus, right? And so a perfect example of looking at this is, again, another way of looking at it is a lot of athletes that take testosterone. So any kind of synthetic testosterone. And so usually synthetic testosterone is more than tenfold as potent as our own regular testosterone, right? And so a lot of these people experience what? So they have hypertrophy of their muscles, right, which is one of the benefits of testosterone, right? But because of this high concentration of testosterone, synthetic testosterone, so let's put like a little 100 times the potency of regular testosterone, you have this inhibition of follicular stimulating hormone and GnRH. And if you remember from before, what is their function? The function is gamete production and development of secondary sex characteristics. So what do they experience? So a lot of athletes that take testosterone, one of the side effects is, the shrivel up of the testosterone, of the testes, right? So the testes become much smaller, indicator of a decreased secretion of these anterior pituitary and hypothalamic hormones, right? And so this is just a brief summary of how these inhibitions and activations are created in a positive and a negative feedback loop.